Hello, Bellarmine Knights. Welcome to Homecoming at Home, a week-long celebration connecting our alumni and friends back to Bellarmine, all from the comfort of your home. While we'll miss seeing you on campus this year for homecoming, join us for a great listing of virtual events, including our first ever virtual silent auction. Due to the pandemic, the Bellarmine University Alumni Board of Directors and Women's Council have teamed to sponsor this virtual auction in support of our incredible students. Bellarmine's silent auction is happening now and ends Saturday, February 6th at 8 p.m. Please visit the link listed to create your account and have some fun bidding on a wide variety of baskets, vacations, bourbon, and more. Thank you for your continued support of Bellarmine University and our students. Go Knights!
I especially feel for these big cats because we as humans have put them here in the US. They don't belong here. It's people who have done them wrong that have done all this to them. And so I just feel like I want to do my best to make right on behalf of my species for their species.
It's been a dream. The world sort of slows down for me. There's one particular cat, Kaya, and she will come up to me and she'll lay down in front of me and we just stare at each other. Oh, sweetness. Ooh, there's sweet Kaya. And we just breathe together, and it's one of my most favorite things to do, is to just be in the moment and hear the cats and see them happy and just be.
I've always wanted to work with animals because they can't speak for themselves. Exotic Feline Rescue Center. So we rescue exotic cats from abandoned, abused, neglected situations.
You say hi?
Most people don't realize that there are more big exotic cats in the US than there are usually in their wild counterparts. A lot of them come from the private trade, pet trade, fur trade, meat trade, just breeding babies for profit. But we are basically a home for those guys.
I was very nervous to start my senior thesis. It's very daunting, but I have loved getting to know the cats. We each have a cohort of cats that we'll observe and just learning their behaviors, learning their idiosyncrasies, their quirks. Some of them are really friendly, some of them are a little more aloof. I love being out here with them and seeing them happy.
It feels so nice because you feel like you're sort of welcomed in their home, because this feels like this is more animal-centered. This isn't necessarily human-centered.
Hi, Lily. Hello, honey.
Hi, Lily. Hi, baby. How are you? They really give you this feeling of contentment and that they're happy and, again, well-fed, and, again, they're chuffing at you, and it really gives you the sense that this is a place where they feel safe and secure. And
How are you, baby? Hi, honey.
So we have 143 cats, and about 100 of those cats are tigers.
we are monitoring the effects of enrichment on cortisol levels in a population of captive felids in Center Point, Indiana. And we are doing that using samples, fecal samples. So we collect those every day.
The not so glamorous part of my thesis is the fecal analysis. And it doesn't smell the best. It's not the most glamorous work.
We actually are going through and administering pumpkins so that they have a chance to have some sort of positive enrichment. Some of the girls are going to be getting regular chicken, some are getting their chicken delivered in pumpkins, and that gives them some sort of a toy to play with, and we're going to see if that actually has an effect on their cortisol levels. In addition, we're going to go through and take some of their fecal samples and culture them to look and see what kind of bacteria they have growing in their gut.
Dr. Doyle has generously allowed us to use her van to process it. So we get to dig through the poop and separate it into different vials and tubes.
These guys are actually fed a diet that consists predominantly of chicken or ungulates, so cows, horses, and so forth. And so that's a pretty good simulation of a wild diet. And so we want to see how close they come to an actual wild microbiome. And we're also going through and freezing some samples just in case we can do some DNA microanalysis in the future.
The more research we have about these big cats, the better. It's so hard to study them in the wild. Even though these guys are different from the wild counterparts, it's great to have that huge sample size. I just hope that all this research that can be done to help them in whatever way, behavioral or medical, is going to help the population at large.
That's the hope, is to help these cats stay healthy.
This gives us the opportunity to give back, and we can give back to this rescue center that's really trying to do the best for these animals. So I think it's really just a great project on both sides.
It's a very self-sacrificing job. You don't get into animal work for the money or the fame. You do it because you like bettering their lives. I'm picking up poop every day, scrubbing out heavy water tanks, wearing a mask in 110-degree heat index because I love these guys and I just want them to have a good life.
I'm Dr. Carrie Doyle. I'm a professor of biology, and I am by trade an evolutionary biologist, and I've spent a number of years looking at the interplay between the endocrine system and the immune system, and more recently expanded my research to include the area of conservation physiology, looking at hormones and the role that can potentially play in conservation, more specifically looking at cortisol and other steroid hormones and the effects that those can have, or different things that can affect different levels of those hormones. Part of that project was also done by my esteemed student, Sylvia Ramsey.
My name is Sylvia Ramsey. I am a bio major with a double minor in biochemistry and art, and I'm also dual enrolled in the MBA program here at Bellarmine. And my honors thesis is on the non-invasive methods of measuring cortisol levels in big cats and gut microbia characterization.
Yeah. So that's what I want to talk about today are non-invasive methods and the ways in which we can use those non-invasive methods to measure things like cortisol and again some of the other steroid hormones, which we'll talk more about in just a bit, and to really characterize and maybe even potentially use some DNA sequencing technology to identify and sort of fully identify all the different components to the gut microbiome or the different microbes that are going to be living in the gut of these particular captive felines, mostly tigers, but we do also have some cougars, some leopards, and some bobcats also in the population of our research group. Now, to start off with, I want to address what is non-invasive monitoring. And non-invasive monitoring is really any sort of monitoring that we can do with organisms that doesn't involve, say, for example, puncturing the skin. So we're not talking about blood draws or biopsies. These would be things that are easily acquired samples. So things like saliva, for example. We can test a lot of things from saliva if we can get salivary samples from an animal. So, for example, this dog here would be pretty easy to get some saliva samples from. Also, hair samples can also be useful for non-invasive monitoring. In particular, at the research center where we've been doing research, hair follicles can actually be used for DNA sequencing. And so that's another means by which we can do some research. And that work's actually being done at Stanford. And it's another way in which we can get some information about these organisms in a very hands-off sort of manner. We are actually studying feces, and it's voluntarily given. We're not doing anything to actually acquire these samples. As such, it actually falls under permissible research for us here at Bellarmine. We don't have an oversight committee for interventional type studies, but observational behavioral type studies or the collection of samples like something like feces don't fall under that purview. So there's some of our samples there. The benefit to this type of monitoring is you can get real-time monitoring and a much more greater frequency. The benefit is that normally when lab work is done, whether it's blood work or some other sort of lab work, it's really just a slice in time. And that can be beneficial, but it would be possibly more beneficial to be able to get information about these animals on a more prospective basis and, again, a much more frequent basis. Faster feedback can potentially transfer or translate to better care. And I somewhat use this term in this context for better care, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, because I feel like the animals actually get excellent care at the facility where we're doing this research, which is the Exotic Feline Rescue Center in Center Point, Indiana. And the research initially started, Sylvia came to me with the idea of doing some work with salivary samples and cortisol using some wild horses, some wild Mustang population, or that particular population. And there were going to be some issues associated with collecting the saliva samples and so forth. And at one point she came to me and said, I want to do work with big cats. And as we started to figure out that we could use fecal samples, that really opened up the possibility for a variety of different research sites. We looked at the possibility of doing some work at the zoo and some other local areas, but we ended up back in December of 2019 going up to EFRC and visiting and the director, Joe Taft, and this is actually the head keeper, Rebecca Stevenson, were both very welcoming, and really all of the crew, all of the keepers have been extremely welcoming in terms of encouraging the research, happy to help out however they can. This is a USDA licensed facility. Right now it houses about 150 big cats as well as some small cats. So this is Max the tiger, who's pretty much the largest cat that they have there. Unfortunately, he's also a bit of a scaredy cat. I made the mistake of scaring him one time, so now I feel like I have to make it up to him every time I see him. And then we have Captain Sparrow, who's a bobcat. And actually the smallest cat they have there is a small Joffrey's cat that's about the size of a small domestic short-hair cat. The facility does not do any shows with the animals. There's no handling of the animals. There's no breeding of the animals. So they're not trying to churn out lots of babies for baby interactive time with the public. This is really a forever home. This is a true sanctuary and a true rescue center. They have been called in to rescue animals from a variety of different situations of neglect and abuse. And once they come to EFRC, they basically can live there the rest of their lives. It is again, a forever home. And one of the things, again, that we wanted to look at was cortisol. So this kind of begs the question of, well, what is cortisol and why would this even really be particularly relevant? Cortisol at its core actually starts as cholesterol. And cholesterol is this 4-ring lipid, which is basically a fat. And this 4-ring molecule of cholesterol can be modified in a variety of different ways to become other hormones. So for example, progesterone or estrogen and testosterone, although physiologically estrogen, the main estrogen hormone is estradiol. So you'll see estradiol written as well. And we also can see aldosterone as well as cortisol. So cholesterol is really our root molecule, but in a variety of different scenarios, and we'll talk a little bit more about cortisol in just a second, we can see a variety of different pieces of information. So for example, if we know about testosterone or estradiol, we can maybe ask a different set of questions. What works out really well with this research is that with the methanol extractions that we do, we actually get all of the steroid hormones. So if we want to go back into the bank of extracts, we can go through and ask other research questions in the future. So the hormone that we are most interested in is cortisol, and cortisol actually comes from the adrenal cortex. Now the adrenals are these sort of fatty looking little triangular or pyramidal dollops that sit on top of the kidneys, and they will secrete 2 different hormones predominantly if we're talking about a variety of different hormones, whether we're talking about the medulla, which is the central portion of the adrenals, or the cortex on the outside. And cortisol, as the name somewhat implies, is going to come from the cortex of those adrenal glands. And it really is sort of a secondary system to maintain a stress response. Typically, if an animal is under stress, we will see a big uptick of typically epinephrine and norepinephrine, which we use the terms epinephrine and norepinephrine here in the United States, but if we were British, we would say words like adrenaline and noradrenaline, which I kind of wish we used adrenaline instead of epinephrine, because there's a sort of slang sort of vernacular that most people are familiar with when they think of the word adrenaline. So think of adrenaline or epinephrine as being that initial hormone during a time of stress, that initial fight or flight. and cortisol as sort of the backup for when the stress response needs to be maintained more long term. And what cortisol will do is it actually makes glucose more readily available. And it does that by allowing the body to access the energy, if you will, that's in proteins and fats, and really start to catabolize or break those down as a sort of backup system as the glucose is being burnt through quite quickly. So as you're burning through glucose, this secondary system can come in and provide additional sugar. So again, this is going to be associated with a stress response. So what are some things that can lead to changes in cortisol? Well, obviously stress. And stress is sort of the textbook example of when you would expect cortisol to go up. And I didn't want to go through and ask the facility to stress out an animal, but I did inquire that if there was going to be a time in which they were going to be doing a knockdown, which is where they go through and anesthetize an animal, which is why it's really important that we have these non-invasive measures, because if we can do things like collect feces or something, we can't even really collect saliva or fur very easily with these animals. But if we can do that, we don't have to go through and do these knockdown procedures. But they do have to be done on occasion for the care of the animals. And if we could catch this sort of blip, if you will, the thought being there would be this uptick of cortisol around the time of the knockdown, then this would be really the textbook way to determine, are our tests sensitive enough to go through and detect this change? So I sort of put a feeler out with the facility and said, if you know there's going to be a time that you're going to be doing a knockdown on an animal, I would really like to see if I can get this snapshot of this uptick of stress to again, or cortisol, to again confirm that the tests are actually detecting such an uptick. When Sylvia and I were talking, we knew we really weren't going to be able, for her project, with the time constraints we were going to have, be able to just sort of sit and wait for the opportunity to catch this stressful event. And so we started thinking more on the converse side of that and say, well, what if you could get a drop in cortisol associated with something that evoked happiness, something that was fun or positive? And that really led to certain research questions. One was, would we be able to see these noticeable changes in this research population? Would we see this uptick of cortisol during a time of stress and this drop in cortisol during times of happiness? And then I wondered if regular monitoring could be beneficial for the facility if it could provide some sort of a predictive power. Once I knew we were going to be collecting fecal samples, I started to explore this idea of the gut microbiome. I have a colleague who's done a lot of work on the human gut microbiome and has found that the impact that the gut microbiome has on overall systemic health is quite huge. And the role that it's playing, although still somewhat being deciphered, is still something that we could look into. And different profiles of organisms, so bacteria, sometimes some yeast, will vary depending upon different types of diets. And again, we know this in humans. If you have an individual who's a vegetarian, they will have a different profile of microbes and bacteria than you would see, for example, for someone who does actually eat meat. And so distinct profiles can be found depending on different diets. And sometimes a dysregulation in the gut microbiome could be a hint that an animal's heading into a disease state, or for example, with us, could be a sign that we're starting to have some sort of dysregulation. So for example, sometimes things like headaches can be associated with the dysregulation of the gut microbiome. And again, this can also serve as a bit of a surrogate for immune function, and looking again at sort of this interplay between the endocrine system or hormones and the immune system, and what the immune system can tell us. So this allowed us to ask some additional research questions. Would a captive population be able to show a microbiome that is distinct? Would it have its own unique microbiome? Would it differ from that in the wild? Typically, the microbiome is seeded by a mother and milk from mom. And at some point, you could trace a lineage back to where these animals would have been in the wild, but most of these animals have been in captivity, and their mothers have been in captivity. Sometimes they've been hand-raised. It's very possible that that microbiome is going to be quite different than what we find in the wild. So that would be something certainly interesting to compare. Are we going to find a similar microbiome profile among a captive group of animals versus a wild group of animals? Although this is a captive group of animals, they really do, I think, a really good job of trying to mimic that wild diet. These cats are fed a variety of different meat, obviously, some chicken, some turkey, but sometimes there are whole pieces of cows or horses or deer that have been brought to the facility by local ranchers who have cattle, for example, or a cow that will die or a horse that will die, and that can be fed then to the animals. So does this diet of ungulates, which is basically a hooved animal, does a diet that is predominant with ungulate, does that actually cause them to have a comparable microbiome to the wild versus, say, for example, a captive animal who's fed logs of soft processed meat, sort of like the equivalent of having a steak on a bone versus ground beef already processed and ground up? And then would this microbiome change during times of stress, whether that be in positive stress, even though we think of stress as being negative, you could have this positive stress with happiness, or negative stress when we see cortisol going up. So the first study I want to talk to you about is the Bella study. And this was really this snapshot opportunity to see if the tests were going to show an uptick of stress or uptick of cortisol hormone at the time of a knockdown. Now, Bella is a otherwise healthy 16-year-old female Siberian tiger, and she is part of Sylvia's project as well, which I'll let her talk to you about here in just a moment. But we were already collecting samples and I was already performing ethograms on her when I started to notice that she was chewing at her foot, at her paw. And upon closer inspection, which again, we're able to get quite close to the animals, I was able to find where she had an ingrown toenail. And immediately that next weekend, a veterinarian was going to be there to do a knockdown for another animal. So they went ahead and Bella ended up on the schedule as well. They were able to do the knockdown and she otherwise was healthy. I really didn't want to catch this stress uptick with an animal that maybe had some sort of a chronic illness or was maybe particularly elderly, but an otherwise healthy animal. And this was really a perfect opportunity to do that. This was actually a picture one day post-op, and you can see the nails no longer embedded in her paw. It's been trimmed, and it's already starting to look like it's starting to heal up. The samples that I have are 7 days prior to the knockdown and then 6 days post. And that's actually comprised of 6 actual fecal samples that cover that 7 days pre-knockdown. And then for the following 6 days, I've got 3 post samples. A lot of times with the knockdown, when they go under anesthesia, they'll vomit. So it might take them a little while to actually have normal transit time and sort of this normal bowel movement afterwards. Samples were frozen for microbiome analysis. I'm still working on that part of it, but the methanol extractions were done in order to go through and do the hormone tests. And enzyme immunoassays were performed in order to detect the cortisol. So then I want to go through and just sort of briefly explain what an enzyme immunoassay is. Well, an enzyme immunoassay uses these molecules that are developed within the body called antibodies. And they're these Y-shaped molecules that have a hypervariable region that's really looking for anything foreign in the body. But antibodies are pretty infamous for clumping together. And we can use this technology or this sort of feature within technology to manipulate, if you will, the antibodies to link themselves together, ultimately then add an enzyme, which is a protein that's going to cause a color change that once it goes through and reacts with the molecule in question. Now, our tests are a smidge different than this, but a typical test will involve a primary antibody, and that's this little upside down Y in the picture. After you add the primary antibody, you add a secondary antibody. Now, the secondary antibody really just wants to bind to any antibody. From there, that particular secondary antibody will have, again, the enzyme associated with it. Once the molecule in question is added, you typically get a color change, and the more the color change, then the more of this particular molecule you have in your sample. So for example, if this is how our cortisol tests work, exactly like this, then the more cortisol that would be present, the more color change we would expect to see. Our tests are a little bit different than this. They're a little bit more challenging. Instead of our secondary antibody just binding to an enzyme, it actually can also bind to the cortisol. So it's going to either bind one or the other. So when we have an actual color change, what that means is that it bound the enzyme and not cortisol. And that's become a little counterintuitive. The darker the color, and it's this sort of yellow amber color, the darker the color, that actually means the less cortisol. And that'll become relevant when we look at some of the data. And so ultimately then the more transparent or the clearer the sample, the more the cortisol is present. So again, when the cortisol comes in and blocks that spot of the secondary antibody, we don't see as much color change because there's not as much enzyme present. So some of the preliminary data so far in terms of the cortisol fluctuations with Bella actually do not show this peak around the time of the knockdown as expected, although it does show a drop in cortisol that's going to happen associated with what I anticipate being that level of discomfort that she had with the ingrown toenail. We, again, don't see that peak of cortisol right at the time of the knockdown or post, but it does start to go through and come back a little bit. But for the most part, overall, the levels of cortisol drop. So the question then was, again, what about positive stimuli? We know that if we go through and have something that's stressful, we can increase cortisol, but is there a way to actually go through and lower cortisol with something that's actually going to elicit a happy response?
So my name is Sylvia Ramsey, and I am a part of the honors program here at Bellarmine. So with honors, every senior has to do a senior thesis. So I decided to do my thesis on tigers, and I approached Dr. Doyle with this crazy idea, and she found a way to make it happen. So I am doing the pumpkin project. So when we approached EFRC about this, we asked for 10 individual girls to observe during my study. So they are aged from 5 to 7, and we chose them because they are individuals, and so if only their feces is in their enclosure, and that there will be no mix-ups between different cats, because some cats live with other cats and some don't, depending on their behavior. And so with my girls, we decided to introduce pumpkins as our positive stress. So because that's something that they normally get. So what we did is we did 5 days of fecal collection before introducing the pumpkins, and then 5 days after to collect a snapshot. So what we did is we gave our pumpkins, which are the enrichment. The enrichment is something that they can interact with. So we hollowed out the pumpkins, and then we would put their meat in it. And we allowed the keepers to choose which of the 5 girls to give the pumpkins to. So we had 5 girls with pumpkins and 5 girls without. So we were hoping to find a drop in cortisol with the introduction of this enrichment of the pumpkin. However, I am still running those samples, so we don't know for sure if there's a drop, but I'm certainly hoping that there is. We also did preliminary microbiome characterization to see if their microbiome matches up with the microbiome of other tigers. So we did preliminary observation in March to establish how we were going to do our ethograms. Ethograms are behavioral studies where you don't interact with the cat, but you sit back and you watch and you record their behavior every minute. So we started my data collection for the pumpkin project on September 8th, and it went through the 18th, and we performed ethograms and fecal collection every single day while doing classes. It was a bit of a madhouse, but it was a blast. So this is Miss Ganji. This is one of the girls in my cohort. So this is her. We had just given her a pumpkin, and she was investigating it for the first time. So she loops around, and then she jumps up, and then she starts sniffing it. And then you'll notice that she will put her head up, and she'll lift her lips, and she will start to scent the air to see if there's any other interesting smells that she can smell besides that pumpkin. So there's her scenting, looking around, checking out her environment, and then she starts to play. So she was the most interactive of all of my girls. She is my resident goofball. She's the most playful one out of my bunch, and so I was hoping that she would have some fun with her pumpkin. So the pumpkins were given on September 13th, which is the 5th day, and we started our extraction procedures soon after we got back. So we used these EIA plates and the microbiome cultures, and we are hoping for data very, very soon.
And as a follow-up to these other 2 studies, I reached out to the center to see if there would be a benefit for prospective monitoring of the cortisol. And I reached out to the keepers to see if there would be a cohort of cats that would be beneficial for them to have some information on, some feedback on in terms of their stress levels. And they came back with 10 cats that included 6 tigers, 2 cougars, a lion, and a bobcat. And I started doing ethograms on these 10 cats and started doing fecal sample collections back in November. And the keepers are collecting the samples for me, and I go every other week to pick up samples. And the hope is that watching them prospectively would hopefully mean that at some point, perhaps something in terms of the health of an animal would happen. They would get sick possibly, or perhaps you would have one that would pass away. And then I could go through and look back retrospectively to see what sort of hormonal profile led up to this particular situation. And that then, once I could determine that there was an actual change in how the hormones were, or really a change in the hormones prior to a particular health milieu, would there be a benefit in knowing that piece of information? So I started doing prospective collection of the samples. And as it turned out, somewhat unfortunately, I actually did have an event happen where we had one of the cats that passed away. And so I'm kind of titling this Phase 2A, the ESSI study. So Esmeralda was an 18-year-old cat. This is a picture over here in the background. She was a bit cross-eyed, and I think as such was a bit skittish, so I somewhat expected that her baseline cortisol levels were going to be a little higher than some of the other animals, although this prospective gathering allows me to use each individual animal as their own control. So I can sort of establish a baseline for each animal, see if it goes up and see if it goes down. I'm also hoping to go through and do some interspecies as well as intraspecies tests to kind of see if there's a certain profile we tend to see in tigers versus a different one in another type of animal, which already is starting to become apparent. The cougars tend to have a higher cortisol level than the others. But with Ezzy, she seemed to be doing fine up until right around Christmas. And I have 5 weeks of her samples leading up to her actual death on December 27th. And it was quite sad. She, died on her own. It wasn't like she had to be euthanized. And she had stopped eating in just a few days prior to her death. I went back and looked at what happened to her cortisol levels in the 5 weeks leading up to that, and was able to find where there was a little bit of an anomaly at week 4, but for the most part, they were continuing to climb. And her high levels prior to her death were by far the highest levels of cortisol I've seen in any of the other animals. So my hope is that once I can go through and convert these values at this point are just optical densities, so the amount of light that will pass through the samples in our plate, again, based on the color change from that enzyme. So if the enzyme's present, the cortisol's not. So when we see a darker color, a higher number pop up, that's going to mean that it's going to be a less cortisol. And so this particular graph is set up as a 1 minus that optical density to give us a little bit more of a better value of what's happening with the cortisol. I'm hoping to eventually, and that's the plan, is to eventually go through and convert these optical densities to a physiological value, some picograms per mole or something like that, where I can go through and really compare more directly between species, for example, and between tests. So at this point, it does look like this prospective monitoring of the animals could really lead to certain profiles that, at the very least, I hope I can tell the keepers that there's a cat that's starting to have high levels of cortisol. Even if we don't exactly know why at that point, maybe it can give them a heads up that this is a cat that they need to watch. So as a work in progress, we're continuing the Phase 2 project. Without Ezzy, unfortunately, so the keepers are collecting now 9 samples for me. But to continue this monitoring, again, hopefully none of the animals will get sick or there will be any issues with their health. But should that happen, there's the possibility, again, to develop this sort of predictive value moving forward, that when we start to see cortisol levels getting out of whack, we can give the keepers a heads up. The microbiome work, I still would like to go through and look at, again, investigating the possibility of doing some DNA microarray analyses, which again would be a lot more specific than just sort of general characterizations. That information is out there for in the wild for both Siberian as well as Bengal tigers, and I would like to see how this group compares on that level of analysis. So that DNA microarray analysis, I think, would be a very interesting next step. Some other sort of future directions, since these extracts have all of the steroid hormones in them, I think it would be really interesting to go back and look at the samples that we have from lions, in particular female lionesses. This idea was sort of planted in my brain by the director, Joe Taft, who pointed out that there will be female lionesses when they reach a certain age that will start to grow manes like the males. And the question would be, well, what's happening with the testosterone levels in those lionesses versus the lionesses that don't tend to show that pattern? I've also read in some of the literature that some of these large cats can actually do what's called infrasound, which is such a low frequency of sound that we can't hear it. We know that elephants, for example, do this in the wild and presumably in captivity. And there's some evidence that some of these large cats do that as well. So I think that would be a really interesting physics-based program, although I don't know have the equipment, nor have a whole lot of background when it comes to sound waves and such. But I think that would be a really interesting project in the future for students. So to wrap up, lots of thanks to Joe Taft and Rebecca Stevenson and all the keepers at EFRC. We have received some funding from Dean Huff as well as from the biology department, and I recently received a grant from faculty development. We've also received a lot of good advice from Dr. Joey Dobbins and Amanda Krishak in microbiology as well as in biochemistry, respectively. And of course, Sylvia in her work with her contribution to the project. And of course, all the cats, and they're all listed there and have been the background wallpapers of most of this presentation.